It's Christmas Day 1989. A man and a woman stand against the concrete wall in a military barracks with their hands tied behind their backs as soldiers raise rifles to their chests. The woman screams at them while the man begins to sing, stuttering over the words of the Internationale, the communist anthem he's sung 1,000 times before. The rifles fire, and just like that, Nicolae Ceaușescu, the man who ruled Romania for 24 years, who starved an entire nation and killed 60,000 of his own people trying to become a cheap copy of North Korea, is dead. But 4 days earlier, he had stood on a balcony in front of 100,000 people, believing he was untouchable, that he was still a god. So how did it fall apart so fast? This is the story of a barely literate factory worker who survived poverty, prison, and a speech impediment, and rose to become a dictator who starved his own people while building palaces. A leader who once defied the Soviet Union and became the hero of Romania, but ended up getting executed like a common criminal. This is the obnoxious true life story of Nicolae Ceaușescu. In January 1918, in a tiny village in southern Romania, a peasant family birthed Nicolae Ceaușescu, the third of the 10 children they would have. His family was large and poor. As a kid, he watched his farmer father work in the fields day and night only to bring home scraps, barely sufficient for the too many hungry mouths. His childhood was spent cold, hungry, and neglected. Although he went to elementary school for a few years, he never really learned to read or write properly. By the time he turned 11, he had grown sick of his poverty, and in desperation to build a life and a name for himself, Nicolae left home. He walked to Bucharest, the capital of Romania, and found work in a factory. He was just a kid at the time, but he labored like a grown man. His shifts were long hours in dangerous conditions with barely any pay, and every day as he worked himself to the bone, he would watch the factory owners walk past him in their fine clothes, speaking in their educated voices, and looking at him like he was nothing. They were everything he ever wanted to be, and everything they told him he could never be. But Nicolae couldn't accept that, because if he did, then what was the point of any of it? The hunger, hard work, exhaustion, and humiliation he had to live through all his life. It all had to mean something. And in the search for that meaning, he one day came across the Union of Communist Youth, an underground communist party, and joined it. He was 14 years old now, and for the first time in his life, someone gave him attention and told him he mattered. In his time at the Union, the communists fed him the beliefs that would shape his personality in the coming years. Beliefs that the factory owners and the aristocrats were the enemy, and that people like him, the workers, the poor, and the forgotten, were actually the ones who would change the world. And being the young naive boy in his puberty, Nicolae believed them. He now had an enemy to blame and a clear direction to aim towards all the built-up anger and hatred he had carried for years. In 1933, when Nicolae was just 15, he was arrested for the first time. He'd been involved in a street fight during a strike. The police threw him in a cell, roughed him up a bit, and let him go. But it didn't scare him. If anything, it made him angrier. Over the next few years, Nicolae was arrested again and again for organising rallies, agitating the government, and refusing to shut up and accept his place. When ultimately in 1936, he was sentenced to real prison. This came as a real blow to young Nicolae because this was the notorious prison where inmates were treated very harshly. And true to its name, this prison made Nicolae suffer so much physical abuse that it left him with a permanent stutter. As cruel as those days were for him, it was in this prison that Nicolae met the man who would change his entire life. The name of this man was Gheorghe Dej, and he was a senior member of the Romanian Communist Party. Dej was older, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone Nicolae had ever met. And for some reason, Dej saw something in this stuttering, barely literate kid that made him take Nicolae under his wing. In their time together in the cold cells, Dej taught him everything Nicolae would later use to become the relentless man he became. He taught him how the Communist Party worked, how to manipulate people, and how to survive in the cruel world. But just like everything has a price, this education wasn't free either. In return for the mentorship, Dej didn't just want loyalty, he wanted obedience. And Nicolae, knowing the value he was getting in return, gave it to him. This slowly built Dej's trust in Nicolae. When Dej held self-criticism sessions in prison, brutal meetings where party members were forced to confess their failures and beg for forgiveness, Nicolae was made the enforcer. If someone refused to attend or question Dej, Nicolae would beat them to make sure they regretted it. But truthfully, he wasn't doing it because he enjoyed it. He was doing it because he had finally understood something fundamental. That in this world, you're either the one holding the stick or the one getting hit with it. And Nicolae had been hit enough. In 1944, chaos erupted as the Soviet Union invaded Romania and its monarchy collapsed. As a result, the underdog communists of Romania, the men who had been rotting in prisons earlier, took over and started running the country. Among those men was Gheorghe Dej, the leader of the Communist Party and Nicolae's mentor in prison, who became Romania's new leader. And Nicolae, being his subordinate, rose with him. He was given positions in agriculture, defense, and a higher rank in the party hierarchy. Dej knew that Nicolae wasn't the smartest or the most charismatic, but he was loyal. And in a world of backstabbers and schemers, loyalty was everything. Nicolae spent the next few years under the command of Dej. During this chapter of his life, he met a woman named Elena, and he instantly felt connected to something familiar in her. Her too being from a small village and barely literate, yet ambitious to do anything to reach the top. Eventually they got married, and she soon became his equal partner in crime. An alliance that over time revealed how her influence deepened his detachment from reality and intensified the brutality of his regime. But before that happened, events took a sharp turn when suddenly in 1965, Gheorghe Dej died. The party immediately needed a new leader, and for Nicolae, this was the perfect opportunity to rise to the position of power he had only dreamt of before. Heated discussions broke out, and eventually, after weeks of infighting and backroom deals, Nicolae Ceaușescu was chosen as the new president of Romania. At 47, Nicolae Ceaușescu stood at the pinnacle of power. The entire nation was now bound to obey his orders. However, for the first few years, Nicolae stayed careful and low profile, at least until 1968, when suddenly everything changed. The Prague Spring movement for freedom broke out in Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union absolutely crushed it, rolling in tanks and killing thousands in the process. The scale of the crackdown sent shockwaves across the world. At this time, when meek silence was expected, Nicolae stood on a balcony in front of 100,000 people, and with cameras rolling live, he condemned the Soviet invasion, calling it a grave mistake. On hearing these bold words from their leader, the crowd erupted. People cheered and waved flags. They got united under a single perspective, and for the first time in decades, Romania felt independent. And the man who brought this revolutionary change felt something he'd never felt before. Nicolae felt like a hero, because suddenly everyone started to love him. Western leaders praised him as a reformer, a maverick, and a communist who dared to stand up to the Soviets. Romania was suddenly the darling of the international community, and Nicolae believed every word of it. He started to think that maybe he was special, that maybe all those cold nights in prison of suffering and being looked down on had all been leading to this very moment, where he was the shining hero in everyone's eyes. But he didn't realise this belief would be his biggest mistake, that the applause wasn't for him. It was for what he represented. The West didn't care about Nicolae Ceaușescu, they cared about standing up to the Soviets. But Nicolae failed to see the difference. He kept thinking that the world loved him, and that delusion would only grow bigger and bigger, until the time comes when it consumes him completely. A couple of years later, Nicolae took a trip that inspired him so much that he changed everything about the way he ruled. In June 1971, he travelled to North Korea to meet Kim Il-sung, the great leader of North Korea, and was struck with awe as he watched Kim's power over his country. He saw tens of thousands of people, soldiers, workers, women, and children alike, perform synchronized parades and dances in their leader's honor. He saw Kim's portraits, slogans, and monuments on every street, and statues of him in every square. He witnessed an entire country built around one man. This spectacle made Nicolae think this was all due to the deep love and respect the nation had for their leader, and Nicolae was mesmerized. He thought, I'm the leader of a country too. Why can't I have the same level of love and respect? Because although he was the most powerful person back in Romania, people still questioned him. Intellectuals still wrote critical essays, and the media still had some independence, and Nicolae hated it. So as soon as he returned from North Korea, he issued a decree called the July Theses that changed the fate of Romanians for the next 18 years. This decree was a list of 17 measures designed purely by Nicolae to transform Romania into a copy of North Korea. It declared to tighten media control, suppress intellectuals, promote nationalism, and most importantly, build a cult of personality around Nicolae Ceaușescu. And just as he had wanted, within months, Nicolae's face was everywhere, staring down from classrooms, offices, and buildings all over the state. His speeches were broadcast live on television for hours, and were made compulsory to be studied and memorized in schools as sacred texts. Newspapers printed his name dozens of times per page. Painters, poets, and musicians were required to produce works celebrating him. He even declared his birthday a national holiday and forced broadcast stations to air documentaries about his childhood, his genius, and his vision. The right to freedom of speech was taken away, and anyone who dared to criticize simply disappeared. Stepping in Kim's footsteps, Nicolae started calling himself the conductor, the supreme leader. He also gave himself the title of Genius of the Carpathians and the Hero of the Working Class. And slowly, what had started as a cheap copy of someone else began to transform into reality. Nicolae was the supreme leader now, and his wife Elena was made the Deputy Prime Minister of Romania. Elena was illiterate and could neither read nor write. This had grown in her an inferiority complex toward educated people that slowly turned into resentment. But with her husband being the dictator now, power erased every limitation. Laws were quietly changed, Elena was awarded a PhD overnight and appointed the head of Romania's chemistry institutes. Scientists were forced to do work for her and add her name to their research. But no one dared say anything because she was now Professor Dr. Elena Ceaușescu, the mother of the nation, and questioning her was treason. This was just the first of many questionable things Nicolae did. As the years of his dictatorship passed and his power grew, Romania started to collapse. Abortion was banned just to increase population. Orphanages became hellscapes. Entire neighborhoods, including churches, hospitals, and national heritage buildings, were demolished to build his massive palace, the Palace of the Parliament, the second largest administrative building to date. And while he obsessed over marble halls, the country starved. Because by the 1980s, Romania was in a serious crisis. It owed over $10 billion in foreign debt, and to Nicolae, debt was weakness and humiliation. he would rather die than admit it. So instead of working out a proper payment plan, he planned to pay every penny back immediately. He exported everything the country had: food, fuel, wood, steel, medicine. Anything that could be sold was sold, leaving the Romanian people cold, empty-handed and destitute. Electricity and gas were rationed. To save on gas on even days of the week, only the cars with even plate numbers could circulate, and on odd days only those with odd plates. Slowly, the entire state reached almost famine-like conditions. Yet that didn't stop Nicolae, and by 1989, Romania's debt was fully paid off. Nicolae stood proudly in front of the cameras and declared victory. He had done it. He had made Romania debt-free, and all it cost was the suffering of an entire nation. The promise of a brighter future, the very foundation on which Ceausescu had built his rule, was now beginning to collapse. The reverence that once surrounded Ceausescu was now curdling into resentment, as the public's eyes opened to the propaganda and the lies they had been told. In newspapers and TV, they were told that they had lived in some sort of paradise with meat overflowing from shelves in mouth-watering abundance, that their GDP set new records every day, and that all the gratitude was due to their exalted supreme leader and his infinitely wise wife. But then people would go to supermarkets and see empty shelves. They would notice their neighbors disappearing. They would hear hushed stories of scholars being tortured in prisons. People would see all this and wonder where all the great things the Romanian media and government boasted of were. People were hungry and angry, but more than anything, they were done pretending everything was fine. So finally, in December of 1989, when Nicolae was in Iran on a state visit, protests broke out in Timișoara city. A Hungarian pastor was being evicted, and people had come out to protect him. But from there, the protest had grown in another direction. People were suddenly chanting against Ceausescu, against his brutal totalitarian regime. On hearing this, Nicolae did something he had never dared do before. On December 17th, he ordered the military to open direct fire on the civilians. Thousands died. The streets of Timișoara turned into a war zone. Blood was spattered everywhere, and gutters ran red. To hide the evidence, bodies were cremated. But now that the people were out, nothing was stopping them. Not even death. They only spread, and by December 20th, the entire country was erupting. And Nicolae, back in Bucharest, believing that it was not yet too late, that his beloved power had not yet slipped from his hands and control could still be restored, decided to call a rally. He knew not that this would be the biggest mistake he would ever make. It was the next morning, December 21st, 1989. Nicolae Ceaușescu stood on the balcony of the Central Committee building, looking out at 100,000 people gathered below. The cameras were rolling. He began his speech, trying to calm the nation and remind them who was in charge. Everything seemed under control, but something sounded off, because although the people in the front rows could be seen clapping now and then, the rest stood hushed and perfectly still. The cheering was fake. It was a pre-recorded track blasting from huge speakers installed around the square. Everything was pre-planned. Unaware of all this, Ceausescu continued his speech, announcing wage rises for the public as if that even mattered anymore. And then, about 10 minutes in, something happened. Screams rose from the back of the crowd. Timișoara, the crowd shouted, as rapidly more voices started joining in. Nicolae stopped mid-sentence, confused. He said, "Hello? Hello?" But no one was listening. The crowd was only getting louder and more charged. Elena, with a look of panic, leaned in and whispered urgently. Security guards immediately surrounded, and Nicolae, for the first time in 24 years of authority, looked scared. He cut the speech short and hurried inside the balcony. Across the country, millions watched live as the image they had been taught to worship fractured in real time. The spell was broken. The public knew their power and now they were not backing down. The next morning, December 22nd, protesters from all over the country stormed the Central Committee building. Nicolae was hit straight in the guts. The empire that he had spent his whole life building was crashing before his eyes. People were now charging up the building. The only thing the Ceausescus could do now was to run for their lives. So Nicolae and Elena fled to the rooftop where a helicopter was waiting. They climbed in and within seconds it took off. Below him, Nicolae could now see the crowds flooding into the building. He couldn't understand it. How had this happened? How had his people turned against him? They surely loved him. He was their hero. So what went wrong? The pilot headed towards the Ceausescu's residence in Snagov, north of the city. There, Nicolae desperately tried to summon military assistance and an escort to flee the country. The answer from the other side, however, was clear. They were on their own. No one was coming to help. Getting more desperate, Ceausescu then tried to contact a military garrison in the city of Titu to land there, when suddenly a message crackled over the radio: all flights are grounded. Any unidentified aircraft will be shot down. With his own military and air force turning against him, Ceausescu was forced to land in a remote area. And then he and Elena were on foot. They knocked on doors asking for help. Some people slammed the door in their faces. Others gave them bread, pretending not to know them. But eventually someone did recognize them. And by the same afternoon, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were under arrest. After 2 days of captivity in the military barracks, on Christmas Day 1989, Nicolae and his wife were brought before a military tribunal. The trial lasted about 2 hours as the charges were all read: genocide, destruction of the economy and public property, abuse of state power, and attempting to flee with over $1 billion in foreign banks. Nicolae simply laughed at the charges and refused to recognize the court, calling the whole thing a Soviet coup. Elena screamed and cursed at the judges throughout, but that didn't change anything because the verdict was already decided. The Ceausescus were guilty, and the sentence was death by firing squad. The execution was to be carried out immediately. In a final, desperate attempt, Nicolae tried to appeal the decision, but his request was blatantly denied. Then he looked at the guards and, as one final wish, asked to be executed alongside his wife Elena. This was accepted. The guards then tied their hands despite their protests, and they were led outside to a courtyard and placed against a wall. Elena, in a final state of fury, once again started to scream and shout insults at the soldiers. Some accounts say that she began to cry. Nicolae, on the other hand, stood relatively calm, maybe still unable to fully grasp the reality, and began to sing with a stuttering, cracked voice, the Internationale, the communist anthem he had sung his entire life. The rifles were raised, and Nicolae Ceaușescu, the little boy from the countryside who had nothing but ambition, who spent his childhood labouring in factories and tortured in prison, the man who was inspired to become a god, the supreme leader who starved his people while building palaces for himself, the hero who defied the Soviet Union, turned into the dictator who killed nearly 60,000 innocent civilians, was now standing seconds away from his last breath. It was 2:50 p.m. The gunshots echoed, and Nicolae Ceaușescu dropped dead.